Stand at a container terminal in Rotterdam and you'll see rows of steel boxes stacked 6 high, corrugated sides, the same corner blocks bolted into every edge. Fly to a port in Southeast Asia or South America and the boxes look identical, down to the same dull red paint and the same 8 metal fittings at every corner. That's not a coincidence you'd expect from an industry with thousands of buyers scattered across the globe. Turn one of those containers around and check the builder's plate welded near the door, and there's a real chance it traces back to one of just a handful of factories, almost all of them in a single country. So how did the manufacturing of an object used by nearly every port on Earth end up concentrated in China? Let's get into it right here on Small Things. Defined by a document. A shipping container isn't really defined by what it's made of, it's defined by a document. International standards specify its exact length, width, and height, down to the millimeter, the load it must carry, and the shape and placement of the 8 steel corner fittings every crane and every ship in the world is built to grip. A factory in one country has to hit precisely the same measurements as a factory anywhere else, because a crane operator loading a ship has no reason to care which factory actually built the box in front of them. That single detail is what turns a steel box into something genuinely difficult to manufacture well. Building one that meets the standard at a price the industry can absorb is a real problem. A converted oil tanker in New Jersey. It did not begin with a factory in China, it began with a converted oil tanker in New Jersey. On April 26, 1956, a trucking entrepreneur named Malcolm McLean loaded 58 steel containers onto a retrofitted ship called the Ideal X and sent it from Newark to Houston. Cargo that had always been carried aboard loose, bag by bag and crate by crate, hauled up and down by hand while a ship sat in port for days, moved instead in sealed boxes that a crane could lift straight off a truck bed and swing directly onto a ship's deck. The cost of handling a ton of cargo fell from around $5.80 to roughly 16 cents, a difference so large that within a few years, ports around the world were racing to build the cranes and yards that this new kind of shipping required. Someone had to build all those containers, and for the first couple of decades, that job belonged mostly to manufacturers in the United States, Western Europe, and later Japan and South Korea, wherever steel production and heavy industry already existed at scale. What changed wasn't a single decision by any one government or company. As container demand kept climbing through the 1970s and 1980s, the work gradually drifted toward whichever producers could combine cheap steel, an already developed shipbuilding and heavy manufacturing base, and enough spare capacity to keep up with orders arriving by the hundreds of thousands every year. One by one, the earlier manufacturing centers found it harder to compete on price without sacrificing the volume the industry now demanded. China checked every one of those boxes earlier and more completely than its competitors managed to, and by the 1990s, most of an industry that had once been spread had settled there instead. That shift has never really reversed. Today, the overwhelming majority of the world's shipping containers, dry boxes, and refrigerated units alike still comes out of factories in China, most of them clustered along the same stretch of coastline where the steel mills, the ports, and the export shipments all happen to already be within easy reach of each other. A handful of companies now produce nearly all of it, a level of concentration that would have seemed unlikely back when container manufacturing was still spread across shipyards on 4 different continents. What it takes to survive decades at sea. So what exactly does it take to build something this outwardly simple that still has to survive decades of hard use at sea without failing? Start with the steel itself. A container spends years exposed to salt spray, monsoon rain, and temperature swings that would eat through ordinary mild steel within a handful of seasons. Manufacturers rely on a weathering steel alloy that does something counterintuitive once it's left outdoors. Instead of continuing to rust away layer by layer, it forms a thin, tightly bonded film of oxidation on its outer surface that seals the metal underneath from any further corrosion. The rust doesn't get scraped off during production or treated as a defect to correct. It's grown deliberately, allowed to form on purpose, and then left alone to keep doing its job for the rest of the container's working life at sea. The bigger engineering problem is what happens once that container gets stacked. On the largest container ships, boxes are piled up to 10 high, and a fully loaded container sitting near the bottom of that stack can have well over 200 tons pressing straight down on it from everything above. None of that weight is meant to travel through the corrugated side walls, which are far too thin and far too flexible to carry a load anywhere near that size. It funnels instead through 8 small steel blocks bolted into the corners, each barely bigger than the palm of your hand, engineered specifically to take the entire load in compression, while the walls around them do almost nothing structural at all. Picture a bookshelf where the shelves themselves are purely decorative and the actual weight of every book on every level runs straight down through 4 skinny posts hidden at the corners instead. Get those 8 castings wrong, even slightly, in the wrong alloy or the wrong dimension, and the stack above them has nowhere safe left to go. Every one of those castings has to be forged to that same exact tolerance, container after container, whether anyone loading the ship that day ever stops to think about it or not. Not about cheap labor. It would be easy to assume China simply builds these cheaper because labor costs less there, and stop the explanation right there without asking anything further. That's not really the full picture, and it hasn't been for a while now. Wages in Chinese manufacturing have climbed substantially over the past 2 decades, rising faster than in many of the countries that used to compete for this exact business. Yet the country's grip on container production has, if anything, gotten tighter rather than looser during that same stretch of time. What actually makes the difference is everything sitting around the factory rather than inside it. The steel arrives from mills a short truck ride away instead of an ocean voyage. The corner castings, the paint, the wood or bamboo flooring all come from suppliers embedded in the same regional supply chain, not shipped in from elsewhere and warehoused for weeks. The finished containers roll straight to export ports that are already handling enormous volumes of outbound cargo, so a newly built box can leave the country already loaded with something else entirely rather than sailing out empty. None of those advantages on its own would be enough to explain the concentration. A competitor could probably match any single one of them with enough investment. Matching all of them at once in the same place, built up gradually over 3 decades, has turned out to be a considerably harder thing to copy. People who never think about the box. Inside a factory floor loud enough that most conversation happens through hand signals rather than words, a weld inspector runs a gloved finger along a finished seam, feeling for the faint ridge that would mean a robotic arm skipped a pass somewhere along the corrugated panel. She flags maybe 1 seam in 50 for rework, marks it with chalk, and moves on to the next one before the line behind her has any real chance to back up. At the far end of the same building, a painter in a respirator works a spray gun into the tight inside corner where 2 panels meet, a spot the automated booths further down the line can never quite reach on their own, no matter how the nozzles are angled. He's done this exact motion so many thousands of times that he no longer really watches his own hand do it, his attention already halfway to the next container waiting behind this one. Half a world away, a warehouse worker in a city he couldn't place on a map backs a forklift into a container that arrived that morning, unconcerned with anything about the box itself beyond whether the floor holds his weight, and the doors swing open smoothly on their hinges. He unloads it, stacks the pallets, and moves straight on to the next one, the container itself already forgotten well before lunch, exactly the way it's supposed to be. An industrial neighborhood. Nobody built China's advantage in shipping containers on a single morning, and no single factory or port explains it either. What sits there now is an entire industrial neighborhood assembled gradually over 3 decades, where nearly everything a container needs is already within reach of everything else it needs. Other countries can match a piece of that neighborhood, sometimes a very good piece, a strong steel industry here, an efficient port there. The box itself never gives any of this away. It arrives at a dock looking like nothing more than a steel crate, corrugated and anonymous, with no hint stamped anywhere on it of the geography it took to make it that ordinary. If this changed the way you look at the next shipping container you pass, let us know in the comments what you want us to explore next. We might make it our next episode. Thanks for watching. History often hides in the smallest details.